Hey guys, Tarke here. In today's video, we're going to be talking about why I think nerfs aren't necessarily a bad thing in Path of Exile. I made a video recently talking about why I think Seismic Trap should be nerfed for the health of the game, and it was met with a lot of criticism along the lines of why nerf when you can buff everything up. So in this video, I'm going to talk about why I think nerfs can be good, but also why nerfs can be bad in PoE. There's not going to be very much exciting visuals, just leave it on in the background and listen to it. Before we get into the main brunt of the discussion, I will just briefly reference the Gauntlet event that happened, and it kind of highlights a lot of what people currently consider the problem builds in Path of Exile. You can see that 15% of the player bases were Champion, Fortify, and Fortify in general is considered a problem point. 28% of the builds were Seismic Trap, 22% of the builds were Detonate Dead, and 15% of the builds were Toxic Rain. Now, there are many other very powerful and viable builds in PoE, but if you ask people to list like the most powerful things currently, there's a good chance they would mention one of those skills. So, I thought it'd be interesting to count how many skills are actually in Path of Exile because it's interesting information to have for this conversation. And of just attack active skills, there are 83. That's not including Vaal skills. And when it comes to spells, there are 96, not including Vaal skills, curses, auras, pure utility spells, etc. But that does include minions, traps, mines, totems. So there are a whole lot of skills, and if you look at PoE Ninja, not much representation. Now, one of the problems with Path of Exile and PoE Ninja is with the way it works, the way it skims a count, you're only ever going to see a very small portion. And because so many players now use PoE Ninja for builds, I know I use it for build inspiration all the time, it's just going to further push people towards the same builds, so it makes a perceived problem seem much worse than it may necessarily be. But anyway, let's get into my points. So, one of the good things about nerfs is it actually opens up design space. So let's say that they were to buff everything up to the current skill power level of these 3 or 4 skills. Even if you buffed everything up, some would still be considered more or less powerful. Some would come online sooner rather than later, but everything would be super powerful. 3.17 has a big focus on bosses, we assume. It's actually this big new endgame league. How do you then gauge the power level of those new bosses? Do you gauge it around the super overpowered builds that is now the vast majority of builds? Or do you pitch it lower or do you pitch it higher? If you pitch it to these super powerful builds, then what about the new players, the inexperienced players who are making their own builds or kind of just troubling through the game themselves? Can they see that content? What are people who are very experienced, like to make their own builds? People who like to play slightly off meta? Where do you pitch the values at? And that's a big thing. If you have these super big builds that are problem builds, which can just trivialize everything and the content isn't balanced around it, they trivialize all the new content. People continue to gravitate towards those builds if they don't find them fun, and that makes a problem point. Also, even ignoring just bosses, just talking about like introducing new items or new support gems, buffing ascendancies, etc. If in the case of something like Seismic Trap, you have this one trap skill which is super dominant, you then can't really add any more trap support without making that one build even better. Currently, if they don't do anything to change Ignite, Detonate, Dead, they can't do anything to help the other Ignite builds without individually changing every single skill, without making that build better. Meaning, they can't introduce any new uniques which scale elemental damage, fire damage, Ignite damage. They can't introduce any cool new passives which scale those things. They can't do any big buffs to certain ascendancies which could scale those things. That's super limiting. And suddenly you have a skill which is limiting not just its own archetype, being Ignite, but also then all elemental spells and all elemental attacks. That's very, very limiting. That's a big issue there. And a lot of the times, these super overpowered builds, they come from these general changes, like the Ignite, Detonate, Dead build. Detonate Dead has been strong for a long time because of the way that Spectre Corp's health works and such. But a big reason why this build is so powerful now is because of this big general change. This clearly wasn't a build that was intended to be powerful, and Path of Exile is such a massive game with such massive scope, there will always be these new problem builds that arise to the top. Some players actually find that quite fun, finding the new problem builds, but that's kind of a different discussion. So by nerfing skills, you often allow other skills to shine. Because if all skills did exactly the same amount of damage or can perceive to be the same level of viable when it comes to killing endgame bosses, clearing tier 16 maps, being tanky, being whatever, players would just gravitate towards whatever does the damage the fastest in the largest area of effect. when we've had periods of the game where the game is being considered easy, or like the general power play levels being exceptionally high, players tend to just gravitate to lots of the same kinds of builds, stuff like Tornado Shot, etc., which just has massive AoE. Now, this isn't helped by a lot of GGG's own design, especially when it comes to league design. GGG really likes to push leagues that force the player to go very, very fast, while then nerfing loads of builds, so that players feel forced to only play the few remaining builds which can go very, very fast while doing lots of damage, while being very tanky. Yeah, that is a problem. That is definitely a problem. And I can definitely understand that frustration there, where people are like, look, if you nerf these problem skills, it's not really opening up the meta, because I'll then just go to playing the second best thing. And I completely understand that argument. Hopefully, nerfs should be met with buffs, so it's a situation of you're having a constant healthy flux and change of skills. For me, my main frustration on Path of Exile tends to come from when you have the same build be one of the best builds for years at a time. I think a 2-league cycle is healthy. If you have a build which is really powerful, let it be really powerful for 2 leagues. That gives the first league people time to discover it, kind of get an idea of what the meta is, work out these crazy new interactions. It then gives one more league for the late adapters to give it a go, and then you can go heavy-handed with the nerfs if you feel like it needs nerfing at that point. Also, sometimes things will even out naturally because in the next league something even better comes along, or the next league has a focus on a different aspect of the game. For example, when we started first getting all this really big focus on boss builds, it pushed a lot of the super clear speed builds out because they didn't have enough single target. Sometimes you can nerf builds without actually changing any core like values, but just by making players shift their focus onto a different aspect of the game itself, which is a more interesting way of doing things generally, but obviously, you know, harder to do. I kind of hinted on this a little bit before, but yeah, players tend to just gravitate towards the most efficient build anyway. So even if everything was to become more powerful, you'd probably still end up just playing lots of stuff like Toxic Rain or Seismic Trap, because it lets you do your damage on the move. This is sort of an issue with how bosses are designed, how a lot of content is designed. But generally, standing still is the worst thing you can do in Path of Exile. So even if every build was capable of doing enough damage, you'd still see a massive focus on the same dot builds, the same minion builds, the same builds that you can damage on the move, just because Path of Exile has a real problem currently that the second you stand still, you just instantly die. And a lot of that is just kind of done down to like minion scaling. And yeah, that's something which will have to change. If it doesn't change, we'll just keep seeing the same cycles and the same kinds of builds being the most dominant ones. Even if it's not the same build every time, it'll be that same kind of playstyle. So let's get into the bad aspect. Let's talk about when nerfs can be bad. Nerfs can lead to fear of missing out. I've definitely experienced this before with builds. There's been a build I've really wanted to play. For example, Dart Pack springs to mind. I league started as a Sire of Shards Magma Orb build in that league, and I had loads of fun. I played to 98 in hardcore. I was absolutely adoring the build, and so I just never got around to playing Dart Pact. I said, it's fine, I will league start Dart Pact next league. They then very famously completely gutted that skill. It lost all of those initial interactions with Vol Pact and everything, and that's a playstyle I never got to try out. And that still annoys me a bit many years later. By going back again to that 2-league cycle, you limit that risk of fear of missing out. But fear of missing out can also come from, for example, we saw this with like the original Castle on Crit changes. You have players who fall in love with a certain type of build. That is their favorite kind of build. There'll be a mechanical change or something. The build no longer functions the way it used to. And now that missing out isn't from something they haven't experienced, but they're like, I cannot experience that ever again. The game just doesn't feel as good. And sometimes those players quit. And that isn't a good thing. That's also something that GG themselves have said they are wary of. So that's a bad side effect of nerfs. Extreme cases can just straight up delete play experiences. Kind of sort of what I was saying just then. But yeah, there have been certain times where certain kinds of builds have come out that felt super unique. They've relied on a certain weird mechanic, or it's just been the way that certain skill has functioned. Maybe like Launch Winter Orb would be a good example. And that was a very fun experience, very unique playstyle at the time, which wasn't super dependent on having insane amounts of gear level, and that was just removed for many players. You can still get builds that kind of function like that now, but they tend to be very expensive. And then you have experiences where people feel like they cannot play something unless they, you know, throw thousands of hours into the game, and then it's just a thing where like The 0.1 percenters, their builds are still the same, but you've hurt the casual player. I hear that argument a lot, and I do understand it. Overpowered builds are great for newer players, or players who are just more casual, for whatever way you define casual, people who just play for whatever reason, who have either less access to time, trade, etc. As again, using 317 as an example, we're seeing a big focus on endgame content. A lot of players are bored with the current leveling system. A lot of players don't enjoy the early parts of the game. They don't even want to play the endgame stuff. Having really overpowered builds that they know are overpowered because they've been overpowered for a long period of time, it gives players easy builds to play that will get them to the exciting content, the content they want to see. And if you nerf everything down, they have to spend more time in the content they don't enjoy. This was very big feedback we saw when it came to making Act 1 harder a couple of weeks ago. People are like, why are you doing this? We hate the acts. You've just made the bit of the game I find tedious even more tedious. What are you doing? And while I don't necessarily agree with that point of view, I can understand that frustration. It's also better for, likewise, for players who don't like to copy builds, but come up with their own builds. If the general power level of everything is much higher, it's much easier to just go into the game completely blind, just make anything work. There's nothing worse in my mind than when you're playing a game, you're super invested into it, you get like 50 hours in and you just hit like a hard wall and you're like, oh, I need to remake my character completely from scratch and start again from nothing. Sometimes that can be really fun, depending on how you are as a player. If you're a dirty min-maxer, you can enjoy that experience. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Especially when it comes to other games like CRPGs, etc. I get very frustrated with stuff like that, so I can understand why people have that same experience with Path of Exile. Obviously, I play Path of Exile for a living. My opinion on Path of Exile is warped. I've been playing it for like 8 years, so I have a pretty good idea of what will and won't work going into it. But I can fully understand the frustration of, you've picked a new skill, for example. There's been a big issue quite recently of GG releases new skills that aren't strong on launch. People feel like they got tricked, and they're like, why doesn't this just launch overpowered? Just make everything launch really powerful, so if I come up to a new league, I pick one of the new skills, it should just work. And generally, honestly, I tend to lean that if anything should be overpowered, it should be the new stuff, so that, you know, every time a new league comes out, you're just like, I'm just going to pick one of the new skills, and I'll just work it out on the fly. I don't really have an issue with that, to be honest. And finally, and this was a point that a few people mentioned on my Twitter, and I can definitely understand this thing, GGG is notorious for like the classic triple nerf. It's not like, oh, okay, so this is slightly overperforming, let's be reasonable, let's bring it down a little bit, bring everything up a little bit. No, what they tend to kind of do is just like full on lobotomize something. They'll take something which was slightly overperforming or very much overperforming, and they'll nerf it from every possible angle. Just like with a mallet, I think is what someone said, a mallet rather than a scalpel. They'll just push it into the dirt, stomp on it over and over and over again, and then they're like, yo, we did the thing, right? So from that point of view, yeah, I can very much understand the criticism to the video I said yesterday saying, please nerf Seismic Trap, but give more support for the other trap skills to make traps more interesting mechanically, because they're like, look, Tarke, yeah, in theory, that would be a nice thing. What will probably happen is they'll just nerf the hell out of Seismic Trap, nerf out the traps, and then we don't have any fun trap builds to play. Is that really what you want? No. Obviously, we want a middle ground. I think you need both nerfs and buffs for a healthy and interesting game. For me, the main thing which can make Path of Exile boring is stagnation. And you're like, but Tarke, you play the same 2 builds every single league. Yeah, but I play them differently every league. It's like, you can play Caustic Arrow, or at least I can, every single league, as long as there's interesting new ways of building every league, like crazy stuff having the passive tree, changing up ascendancies, new items, new this, new that. Having that sense of exploration is really interesting. If, however, you get to a point with Path of Exile where it's just the same builds over and over and over again, and you're just building them the same way, and the playstyle's the same every single time, and every new piece of content that comes out is being met with the same answers, then yeah, that can be pretty boring. So that's generally why I, anyway, kind of hope that we see some nerfs with some buffs, but also GGG trying to focus on introducing new types of play through the kinds of content they create. I would be kind of frustrated if we have the same dot builds or the same kind of play styles being the go-to build you play every single league, not because you like the archetype, just because if you ever stand still in PoE, you die. Anyway, I'm Tarke. Have a good day, and hopefully that won some people over to the sometime nerfs are a good thing crowd. Bye-bye.